welcome back. And in this video within our series on personality, we're going to spend a little time now focusing on aspects of our personality that sometimes can be less than helpful. And whilst this might not be as comfortable an area about personality to explore as looking at our strengths and everything that positive that we can bring to the table, I think it's extremely valid, particularly in a leadership position, for us to be considering what are the aspects of our behaviour that may to some extent derail us as leaders, as team members, as those that need to go out and influence stakeholders. Now, some of us are better at managing our personality traits than others, but all of us have the capability of behaving in ways that later on down the line we may regret or even regret within the moment. Many of these are linked to stressors, or what I might refer to here as triggers within the environment. But they can also be triggered by our own internal sense of well-being. So, for example, we may behave in ways that are less than palatable for us meeting our objectives when, for example, we're just plain tired, when we're bored, when perhaps we're hungry. These things are triggers that we need to be aware of, and we'll all have different triggers. Some of us can cope better with being hungry and go into a stressful meeting than others. Hence the term hangry has often been used. So we have all these various triggers. And in one area of personality study, which is in the Hogan suite of psychometrics, which is something that we do with many people within our programs, and I'm going to come on to the Hogan suite a little bit later on. In that set of psychometrics, it includes looking at what they refer to as our bright side and our darker side. And the darker side on that is when very often our strengths are overplayed in a particular situation, and they actually start to derail us and give us behaviours that aren't so helpful. Now, within the Hogan suite, I think it's quite useful, the analogy that they use is that we often exhibit these darker, less helpful aspects of our behaviour and our personality when we forget to manage our reputation. And what they mean by that is that when we are typically calm, considered, logical, human in our nature. Now, what I mean by human is that we are society driven, so we might be looking out for the needs of others around us. Then when we're in that kind of mode, we tend to manage our reputation. We think about how we're coming across to others, and therefore we tend to act on our, in a sense, best behaviour, act professionally, ethically, and to the best good of everybody around us. Now, when we're stressed, and whatever stress triggers occur for you, they're worth considering, we tend to stop managing our reputation. And I'm sure, like myself, I'm going to put my hand up on this as well. There are times when you're just tired and you haven't got the tolerance for your team the way you have in the past. Or things are just happening where you're stressed, you've got too much work on, and right here, right now, you don't particularly give a damn how you're coming across to other people. Now, you may not be thinking that, because these thoughts, these feelings, these emotions that are creating stress through triggers, things that just can come up upon us and take us unawares. And before we know it, we're behaving in a way that later on, when we've calmed down, we might regret. So this aspect of forgetting to manage our reputation in the environment is a really important one. Now, when we do forget to manage our reputation and these derailing behaviours start to emerge, they can emerge from different systems within our brain and in our physiology. And on the screen here, I'm going to show just 3 primary levels that we might consider that our brain is operating at. We first have the reptilian brain, if I may call it that. I know scientists may say, no, they're different systems that you've got to consider. But if we just consider first off, there are elements of our brain that just get on with managing our systems, such as triggers in our brain that make our heart beat, that process our liver, that trigger things related to our nervous system. Now, all creatures with a stem cell and a nervous system share that similar type of functioning. Then we move up to higher levels of thinking, where we might refer to our primitive brain, or as I referred to in an earlier video about the chimp paradox, I made reference to our emotional machine. Now, it's actually our emotional machine that is the one that can often get into trouble in respect of things like derailers and behaviours that we later come to regret. And then at a higher level, we have what us humans are very, very good at, because we're problem-solving machines. We can communicate, and that's what's enabled human beings to be at the top of the, shall we say, dominance hierarchy within nature. And that's our cognitive brain, our problem-solving brain. Now, that's the one that fundamentally we would like to be operating with most of the time, because that's where our society-driven aspects of our brain also are included there. So when things are going well, and all the information comes in from our environment, it goes through obviously our senses, that might be aspects of our reptilian brain. And if there's nothing to be concerned about as regards stresses in the environment or stresses within ourselves, then our primitive brain sort of remains pretty relaxed, lets all the signaling go through to our cognitive brain, and we operate in a way that is rational and perhaps is best for the situation. And from that, out comes our behaviour. And hopefully, for most of us, most of the time, it's positive, constructive behaviour that gets us to where we need to get to. However, when we get triggers in the environment or triggers within our own physiology, or our thoughts and feelings come into play, those signals can get distorted. The emotional machine gets hold of the messaging, gets hold of the processing of the world around us, and actually what it does is it holds on to the blood supply and the oxygen. The cognitive part of our brain, typically the frontal lobes, the frontal cortex there, tends to have a little bit more of a shutdown. It doesn't get the messaging, it doesn't get the blood supply, and so the behaviours that we exhibit come more from our emotional machine, typically in forms of fight, flight and freeze responses. And it's of course these fight, flight, freeze responses then that can get us into trouble. For example, if we're in a meeting that's a little bit agitating for us, and it seems like there's a bit of blame culture going on in the air, then some of us will have aspects of our personality that draw us towards fighting. Now, that won't necessarily be, and I hope this isn't the case, physical fighting, but we get into that fighting spirit. And we may get, in a sense, either defensive or go on the attack to other people. Now, typically in humans, this is done almost on a psychological basis and through our speech and our language, but also through our body language can come across being intimidating. So it can be very powerful as leaders or team members to really understand what our triggers are and how we can best deal with those. Now, when it comes to understanding that, one of the areas that we highly recommend that people look at is this Hogan suite, as I mentioned. And one of the aspects of their suite of psychometrics that we use here at the Project Academy is the Hogan Development Survey. And I've put a little slide up on the board here just to show you the kind of output that comes from reports, but then behind that is a lot of detail. But this is just the graphics. Now, on the left-hand side, it shows 11 traits that are known by psychologists and through the Hogan suite and the development survey to be potential derailers for us. And I'll come on to these in a little more detail later on. But if you get the sense that there are 11 key trait measures that can link to derailers, they can act on a scale from low risk to high risk. So someone who measures high on this risk needs to be aware that this derailer can manifest itself in their day-to-day working, particularly under stress. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, that takes it into a little more detail. Each of the 11, and then there's sub-traits within that, and then they've got little bar charts that show the degree to which a respondent seems to indicate that those are potential triggers for them. The way in which the Hogan suite works on this front is that instead of asking an individual what are your triggers, the way in which a well-crafted psychometric here works is that they do the research that says people who answer a question in this particular way are observed by others to behave in this particular derailing aspect. So what that is looking at people's responses and not self-assessing, but saying when you respond to a question this way, this is what people tend to see in you. And this can be very powerful to start to understand, well, what are my triggers? And so what I'm just going to show within that is that there are 3 clusters within those potential derailers, and you might want to consider these both during and after this particular video. There's 5 of the 11 that deal with moving away from others. So these are aspects that come into play when perhaps our behaviours cause us to move away from others, whether we withdraw or others withdraw from us. There are other traits in there. There are 4 of them on the screen here that relate to moving against others. This tends to be when our derailing behaviours start to be more combative in their nature. And then for some, there are a couple of traits in there that are about moving towards others. This is when we are almost overplaying our aspects of being dutiful and diligent, and they actually get in the way. I'm going to show some examples in just a moment. So I'm now going to take you through just 3 examples, one in each of those main categories, of the kinds of derailing behaviours and what you might be able to do about them. So let's look at one that's referred to in the Hogan suite as excitable, and this fits into the moving away from others category. Some of the performance implications that can occur when this excitable trait is overplayed, particularly under stress, is that people can come across as intense, energetic, but volatile at the same time, sometimes even explosive. They may quit or because they get frustrated with the work, or yell when they get angry, yell at others within the team. And there can be a tendency to overact to criticism as well. So some of the things you might work on in this from a coaching perspective is firstly recognise that it's a strength but is overplayed. So for example, acting with passion and energy and enthusiasm is great. Carry on doing that. That's a positive energy that you bring. But the things to consider stop doing is when you get triggers in your environment is losing emotional control or allowing these emotions to run away with you, and things such as being very aware of and stop raising your voice and yelling at others, which will just create stresses. It's a sure sign indication that we're stressed ourselves but aren't perhaps recognising it. Some of the things to consider start doing in the excitable area here is to analyse situations that trigger you, that become frustrating for you or upset you. Learn to recognise these signs before you lose control. This requires an element of mindfulness and self-awareness to see when the energy levels are bubbling up to an area that may well start to derail you. And therefore, leave the situation, take time out, and then come back to it when you've levelled out your emotions. Another area is called bold, a trait called bold, which is one that is deemed to be moving against others. So a performance indication here when it's been overplayed, again under stress, is someone can overestimate their abilities and competencies to undertake work. Maybe has trouble learning from mistakes and therefore learning next time they do things. And they may tend to presume to always be correct, even without seeking input and advice from other people. Another risk that comes with the boldness trait when it's overplayed is a sense of feeling entitled to leadership positions, to be able to take charge of others. So some of the coaching tips around that might be keep being a role model for others. Be positive in your attitudes to particularly challenging problems. So keep hold of that, but up to a certain level. Things to avoid or stop doing are going to be over-promising around things and then blaming others when things don't turn out the way you expected them to. And things to consider to start doing are sharing credit, for example, with staff for successes, because a risk of boldness here is that people take credit for the team's work when in fact we really need to be sharing that credit. The third example I have for you is the one around diligence, which is one of these areas which is around moving towards others, but it can have some side effects. So some of the performance issues around this on diligence can occur when we tend to micromanage our staff rather than let them get on with their work after good delegation. Someone who overplays the diligence front, particularly as a boss, may try to do everything equally well, rather than saying, well, what does require absolute detail and what requires, say, an 80-20 rule here, where we need to be in the ballpark in order to make decisions. So people that overplay their diligence can be very difficult to please and can be very uncomfortable with ambiguity. Now, if you think from a leader point of view, we often have to deal with ambiguity. So it can be good to be able to accept ambiguity in the environment and not let our diligence be overplayed and make things uncomfortable for ourselves and those around us. So some coaching tips there would be keep on absolutely working hard, being careful, being a role model for high standards, but to stop any areas where you could be over criticizing of subordinates' work or pointing out other people's shortcomings because they're not quite matching up to your own exacting standards. Because is that really realistic? And is that what the job demands? Another thing you can start doing is delegating a little bit more, delegating those tasks so people in your team are allowed to make a few mistakes, because that's when people learn. Give them the framework to operate in, but don't be so overbearing that they're now scared to make mistakes, because that will derail them in their particular traits. So there's some examples of where we can get some derailers occurring within our personalities, where our strengths are overplayed, where we forget to manage our reputation in the environment, and the stress and the triggers in the environment get hold of us and we behave in ways that we're not too proud of. So the takeaway coaching exercise I have for you here is, first off, after this video, why not sit down and consider what are the triggers in your environment or within yourself that you know can catch you out. Maybe you've had some feedback from other people in the past, from colleagues or bosses, of potential derailing behaviours that have been perhaps unpalatable and unhelpful to others. And are those behaviours that still catch you out every now and then when you exhibit these under stress? So the third question in this is to consider, what are the methods you could use, or maybe you are using at the moment, to better manage your personal awareness, your stress levels, so that you can prevent these triggers causing these sort of derailing behaviours in the future. So good luck with that. I appreciate it's an uncomfortable area to uncover, but actually it's one that if you can manage your triggers and your potential derailing traits within your personality, you've got a far greater chance of moving forward in the leadership pipeline. See you in the next video.